They locked him in with a woman no man dared stand near. And before the echo of iron bars faded, Ethan Cole understood something was wrong, not with her, but with everything he thought he knew, because the guards didn't shove him into that stone cell like a man being punished. They placed him there like a piece on a board already set, and she was standing in the far corner, still as dry wood in winter, watching him the way the desert watches a storm roll in, not afraid, not curious, just certain. And that certainty settled under his skin slower than the chill creeping through the rock floor beneath his boots. He kept his distance, 5 feet, maybe 6, enough to show he wasn't looking for trouble, enough to keep his back to the wall where no one could come at him unseen. The air smelled like dust and old iron, the kind that clung to your throat and stayed there. And somewhere down the corridor a chain dragged across stone, then silence again. Thick and patient, he'd been in tight places before, holding pens during storms, bunkhouses with men who didn't trust each other. But this was different, because in those places you could read the room, measure the danger, count the odds. Here, the danger didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe like it belonged to the same world. She stood tall, taller than most men he'd known, her dark hair falling over one shoulder in a way that looked careless but wasn't. Nothing about her felt careless, not the way her weight rested evenly on both feet, not the way her hands stayed loose at her sides, ready without showing it. And when she finally stepped forward, just one step, the kind that should have meant nothing, Ethan felt his shoulders tighten before his mind caught up. Instinct older than reason, the same instinct that told a rancher when a horse was about to bolt or when a storm would break early. She stopped 2 paces away, close enough that he could see the faint line of a scar along her wrist, not fresh. Not hidden either, just there, like a story she didn't bother explaining. Her eyes met his, dark, steady, not asking, not warning, just seeing, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because whatever needed saying didn't belong to words yet. Ethan cleared his throat, low, careful. "I keep to myself," he said, not a challenge, not an offer, just a line drawn in dust. Her gaze didn't shift, didn't soften. But something in it changed, like wind turning before you feel it. "You won't have to," she answered, her voice quiet, even, carrying no edge. And that was what unsettled him most. Not the words, but the lack of weight behind them. Like she wasn't telling him something. She was stating it, the way a man might say the sun would rise. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, glanced once toward the bars, thick, cold, space too narrow to slip through. And beyond them, the guards stood farther back than they needed to, not watching close, not crowding, just waiting, and that didn't sit right, because men who held power liked to show it. They liked to linger, to remind you where you stood. These men kept their distance, like there was a line they wouldn't cross. Ethan looked back at her, studied the way she held herself, not like a prisoner, not like someone cornered, but like someone who had already decided where she stood in all of this. And the cell, the walls, the bars, they were just details around that decision. "What's your name?" he asked, more to hear something normal than anything else. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached up, fingers brushing the thin leather cord around her neck, a small piece of turquoise catching the low light. Worn smooth, carried long. Then she lowered her hand and said, "Ayana." Simple, clear, like it didn't need anything else. He nodded once. Ethan. And the names hung there between them, not as introductions, but as something being acknowledged. Outside, a boot scraped against stone, one of the guards shifting his weight. Ethan's eyes flicked that way again, and when he looked back, Ayana had moved, not closer, not farther, just angled slightly, placing herself between him and the bars without making it obvious. And that was when it clicked. Slow and heavy. She wasn't closing him in. She was standing in front of him, like a shield no one had asked for. He felt a flicker of irritation rise, the kind that came from being handled, from being placed in a position he hadn't chosen. "I don't need protecting," he said. Quieter this time, because something told him loud words didn't belong here. She didn't turn to face him fully. Her eyes stayed on the corridor beyond the bars, but her voice carried back to him all the same. "No," she said. "You don't." A pause, just long enough to settle in his chest. "But you were chosen." And that word sat different, heavier than the rest. Chosen, not owned, not taken, something else. Something he couldn't quite reach yet. The lantern light outside flickered once, shadows shifting along the walls. And for a brief second, Ethan saw the guard straighten, not in alarm, not in readiness, but in something closer to respect, and it ran cold down his spine, because men like that didn't respect prisoners, not out here, not ever. He looked at Ayana again, really looked this time, at the calm in her shoulders, the stillness in her breath, the way the space around her felt, held, like nothing entered it without permission, and suddenly the cell felt smaller, not because of the walls, but because of what he didn't understand yet. He had spent years reading land, reading men, learning the language of silence that kept you alive when words failed. But this was a different kind of silence, older, deeper, and it didn't belong to him. Not yet. He shifted his stance, boots scraping lightly against stone, grounding himself in something familiar, something solid. Chosen for what? He asked. And this time she turned, fully, her eyes meeting his again, not hard, not soft, just certain. To walk out, she said, and somewhere beyond the bars, one of the guards lowered his gaze, just for a second, like he had heard something he wasn't meant to question, and that was when Ethan realized, slow as sunrise over open land, that the door in front of him wasn't the thing keeping him inside, and whatever they had locked in this place, it wasn't her. The silence after her words did not break. It deepened, like the kind that settles over open land before a storm decides whether it will pass or stay, and Ethan Cole felt it press against his ribs in a way he could not shake, because nothing about this place behaved the way it should, not the guards who stood back like hired hands waiting on orders they did not question, not the iron door that had not rattled once since it closed, and certainly not the woman standing between him and everything outside as if that space already belonged to her. He shifted his weight again, boots scraping softly across the stone floor, grounding himself in something real, something earned, because out on the range a man trusted what he could see, what he could measure, distance, wind, the angle of light before sundown. But here, those things did not add up. Here, a single word from her carried more weight than the bars in front of him, and he did not like that, not one bit. "You talk like you have already walked out," he said, his voice low but steady, and she did not turn this time, her eyes still fixed beyond the cell, as if she was watching something he could not yet see. "I have," she answered, simple as breath, and that should have sounded like madness, but it did not. It sounded like truth spoken in a language he had not learned yet. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, the kind a man lets go when he realizes the ground under him is not as solid as he thought. He glanced again at the guards. One of them shifted, just slightly, adjusting his stance, but not stepping closer, not asserting anything, just holding position like a man who knew exactly where he was allowed to stand. And that was when Ethan noticed it, small, easy to miss, the way their eyes never rose above her shoulders. They did not meet her gaze, not once, not even by accident, and that was not fear. He had seen fear before. It came with tight jaws, quick hands, restless movement. This was something else, something closer to restraint, to respect given where it was due, and it sent a quiet chill down his spine. He turned back to her, studying the line of her shoulders, the steady rise and fall of her breath, the way she seemed to belong to the stillness instead of fighting it. "If you are not their prisoner," he said slowly, choosing each word like stepping stones across a river, "then what are you doing here?" And for the first time since he had been thrown into that cell, she moved without purpose tied to him. She took a step toward the bars, not crossing the space fully, just enough to let the lantern light catch her face. And in that light, he saw something he had not seen before, not hardness, not distance, but patience, the kind that comes from knowing time is not something you chase. It is something you wait for. She rested her fingers lightly against the cold iron, not gripping, not testing, just touching it as if it were part of a story already told. "They needed a place to speak without being seen," she said, and Ethan frowned, the words not fitting the picture in his head. "Speak to who?" he asked, and this time she turned just enough for him to see the faintest trace of something in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything he could name. "To my people," she said, and the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like wind changing direction across a field you have known your whole life. Ethan's jaw tightened. not in anger, but in the effort to keep his thoughts lined up in a world that was starting to tilt. You are telling me this place. He glanced around the narrow cell, the stone walls, the iron bars, the dim light that barely reached the corners, is not a prison. And she met his eyes again, steady, unshaken. It is a door, she said, and that word landed heavier than anything else she had spoken, because a door meant choice, meant movement, meant there was more on the other side than what he could see. Ethan rubbed a hand along the back of his neck, feeling the grit of dust against his skin, grounding himself again. He had spent years avoiding trouble, keeping his head down, working land that did not ask questions, because the world outside had taught him what happened when you stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this was not wrong place or wrong time. This felt like being placed exactly where he was meant to stand, whether he liked it or not. And me, he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less certain, what part of that door do I play? And for the first time, she stepped closer to him, closing the distance not as a threat, not as a claim, but as something deliberate, something chosen, the space between them shrinking to no more than 2 feet, close enough that he could see the fine detail in the turquoise stone at her throat, the way it caught the light and held it, like it had done for years before he ever stepped into this place. You were not placed here by accident, she said, and there was no force in her tone, no push, just a statement that settled into him whether he agreed or not. In my tribe, she continued, her voice steady, carrying the weight of something older than the walls around them. We do not take what is not ours. We do not stand beside those who cannot stand for themselves. And we do not choose lightly. She paused then, just long enough for the words to take root. I chose you. And the way she said it stripped the meaning down to something clean, something without ownership or demand, just decision, just intent. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not surrender, not acceptance, but recognition of a line he had just stepped across without knowing it was there. He held her gaze for a long second, searching for something that would let him dismiss this, something that would make it simple again. But there was nothing there except truth spoken plainly, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because lies you could fight, truth you had to face. A sound echoed down the corridor then, faint at first, then clearer, footsteps, measured, deliberate, not hurried, not uncertain. And for the first time since he had been thrown into that cell, the guards shifted more than just their weight. They straightened fully, shoulders back, heads slightly lowered, and Ethan watched as the space outside the bars changed, not with noise, not with force, but with presence. Something or someone was coming, and whatever it was, it carried more authority than the iron that held that place together. He looked back at Ayanna, expecting tension, readiness, something that matched the shift outside, but she remained still, calm, as if this moment had already been accounted for, long before he ever stepped into that cell. And that was when he understood something he had been resisting since the door closed. He was not waiting for something to happen. He was already standing inside it. The footsteps did not hurry. They did not echo with urgency. They carried something heavier than sound, something that made the air itself seem to shift out of the way. And Ethan Cole felt it before he understood it, the way a man feels thunder long before the sky breaks. The guards outside the cell straightened fully now, not stiff like men bracing for trouble, but aligned, like men who had already accepted what was coming. And none of them reached for their weapons. None of them spoke. They simply stood, eyes lowered just enough to show they knew their place in whatever this was. Ethan's gaze followed the corridor, watching the dim light stretch and bend around a figure that had not yet fully appeared. And beside him, Ayanna did not move, not even a shift of weight, not even a breath out of rhythm. She stood as she had from the beginning, grounded, certain, as if the moment unfolding had already passed through her mind long before it reached his. You knew, Ethan said quietly, not accusing, not questioning, just placing the truth where it belonged. And she answered without turning, yes. And that single word settled into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. No ripple, no disturbance, just depth. The figure in the corridor came into view then, not in a rush, not in shadow, but in full presence. A man older than most, his hair streaked with gray, his posture straight without strain, wearing no badge, no symbol of authority that Ethan recognized, and yet everything about him spoke louder than any uniform could. He walked with the kind of calm that came from never needing to prove anything. And as he approached the cell, the guard stepped back without being told, giving space not out of fear, but out of respect that had been earned long before this moment. Ethan watched closely, every instinct awake now, measuring, reading, trying to place this man within a world that had rules he understood. But the more he looked, the less those rules applied. The man stopped a few feet from the bars, not reaching for them, not testing them, just standing there, his eyes lifting slowly, not to Ethan, but to Ayanna. And in that look, something passed between them that did not need words, something that carried history, trust, and something deeper than either of those. "You are late," Ayanna said, her voice calm, not sharp, not softened, just honest, and the man inclined his head slightly. The road was longer than expected, he replied, his voice steady, carrying the weight of miles traveled without complaint. Ethan felt the shift again, subtle but undeniable. This was not a meeting between prisoner and authority. This was something else entirely, something that made the walls around them feel like nothing more than a suggestion. The man's gaze moved then, slowly, deliberately, until it settled on Ethan, and for the first time since he had been brought into that cell, Ethan felt truly seen, not judged, not measured, just seen, and it held him still in a way no threat ever could. "This is the one," Ayanna said, not asking, not explaining, just stating, and the man studied Ethan for a long moment, his eyes quiet, thoughtful, like he was reading a story written in a language only he understood. Ethan did not look away, not because he was unafraid, but because something told him looking away would mean losing more than just ground. "He does not know," the man said finally, and Ayanna answered, "He will." And that exchange, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything spoken since Ethan had stepped into that place, because it placed him inside something that had already begun without his consent. The man nodded once, slow, deliberate, then stepped closer to the bars, still not touching them, still not acknowledging them as anything that could stop him. "You have been told this place is a prison," he said, his voice steady, directed at Ethan now. "But a prison holds those who are meant to stay." He paused, letting the words settle. "This place holds those who are meant to choose." Ethan felt the words land, not as comfort, not as threat, but as something he could not ignore. He shifted his stance slightly, boots grounding him again. "Choose what?" he asked, and the man's gaze did not waver. "What kind of man you will be when the door opens," he answered, and the simplicity of it struck harder than anything else could have, because it left no room for blame, no room for excuse, just choice, plain and unavoidable. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind working through it, searching for the edges of something he could hold on to. "And if I do not walk out?" he said, testing the weight of the idea. The man nodded slightly, as if he had expected that question. "Then you will stay," he said, "but not because you are held." Another pause, just long enough for the meaning to settle. "Because you chose not to leave." And that distinction cut clean, sharper than any blade, because it stripped away every reason Ethan had ever used to explain the turns his life had taken. Every moment he had told himself he had no say in what came next. Ayanna stepped forward then, just one step, closing the space between them again, her presence steady, unwavering. "You are not here because you are weak," she said, her voice low, certain. "You are here because you stood when others stepped back." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest at that. Not pride, not fear, something deeper, something he had buried under years of keeping his head down and staying out of trouble. The man outside the bars watched them both, silent now, as if his part in this had already been spoken, and the air settled again, heavy, waiting. Ethan looked from Ayanna to the man and back again, and for the first time since the door had closed behind him, he understood that nothing in this place was meant to trap him. It was meant to reveal him. And somewhere deep in his bones, something long quiet began to stir, not loud, not certain, but present, like the first hint of dawn before the sky changes, and he knew, without knowing how, that whatever happened next would not be decided by the bars, or the guards, or even the people standing before him. It would be decided by him, and that realization carried more weight than any chain ever could. The words did not leave him alone after they were spoken. They stayed, settled into the quiet like dust that refuses to lift, and Ethan Cole stood there with the weight of them pressing in from every side. Not heavy like chains, but steady, unavoidable, like the truth a man spends years walking around only to find it waiting exactly where he started. He let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting once more to the bars, to the narrow corridor beyond, to the guards who had not moved except to give space. And for the first time he noticed something he had missed before, the door. At the end of that corridor, not locked, not guarded, just there, slightly open, like it had been waiting long before he arrived. That door, he said quietly, not looking at either of them. It is not closed, and the man outside the bars gave the faintest nod. It never was, he replied, and that answer carried no surprise, no explanation, just confirmation of something Ethan had already begun to understand. Ayanna stepped beside him now, not in front, not behind, but level, her presence no longer a barrier, but a choice standing within reach. Most do not see it, she said, her voice calm, because they are waiting for someone to open it for them. Ethan gave a small, humorless breath at that, the kind that comes when a man recognizes himself in words he would rather not hear. He had spent years waiting without calling it that, waiting for the right season, the right chance, the right moment that never quite came, always telling himself it was not yet time, always finding a reason to stay where he was, because staying felt safer than stepping into something he could not measure. He glanced at her, really looked this time, not as a stranger forced into the same space, but as someone who had already stepped through a door he had not even acknowledged. And you, he said, you saw it. She did not hesitate. I was raised to, she answered, and there was no pride in it, no claim, just fact. The man outside the bars shifted slightly then, drawing Ethan's attention back to him. Your world teaches you to wait, he said, his tone neither critical nor kind, just steady. To measure, to calculate, to survive by staying where the ground feels certain. He paused, his eyes holding Ethan's. Ours teaches us to recognize when the ground beneath us is already moving. Ethan felt that settle deep, because he had known that feeling before, out on open land, when a storm rolled in faster than expected, when cattle shifted before the wind changed, when something told you standing still was the one thing you could not afford to do. But he had ignored that feeling more times than he could count, choosing certainty over truth, choosing stillness over risk, and now here he stood, in a place where stillness had been stripped of its comfort, leaving only choice behind. Ayanna reached up then, her fingers brushing the leather cord at her neck again, the turquoise stone catching the low light, and without ceremony, without hesitation, she slipped it free, the cord sliding easily through her fingers. She held it for a moment, just long enough for Ethan to see the wear in it, the years carried in something so small. Then she extended it toward him, not forcing, not insisting, just offering. In my tribe, she said softly, we do not bind what we choose, we stand with it. Ethan looked at the pendant, at the simple stone that seemed to hold more weight than anything else in that room. He did not reach for it right away, his hand hovering at his side as his mind worked through what this meant, because this was not possession, not a claim the way he had first thought. This was something else, something that asked for more than it took. If I take that, he said slowly, what changes? Ayanna's eyes met his, steady as ever. Nothing you are, she answered. Only what you are willing to stand for. And that cut deeper than anything said before, because it did not ask him to become someone else. It asked him to stop pretending he was not already standing at that edge. The man outside the bars watched in silence, not urging, not intervening, just present, as if this moment belonged entirely to Ethan and no one else. The corridor behind him remained still, the open door at the far end unchanged, waiting without pressure, waiting without demand, and Ethan felt the pull of it now, not as an escape, not as a way out, but as a line he could cross or ignore, and for the first time in a long while, he understood that ignoring it would be a choice just as much as stepping through. He exhaled slowly, then lifted his hand, taking the cord from her fingers, the leather rough against his skin, the stone cool, solid, real, and as it settled into his palm, something in him shifted, not dramatic, not sudden, but certain, like a weight finding its proper place. Ayanna watched him, not searching, not questioning, just witnessing. And that made it heavier, because she was not waiting for him to prove anything. She was waiting to see what he would choose. Ethan closed his fingers around the pendant, then looked toward the open door once more, the space beyond it quiet, unknown, and for a moment, the old instinct rose again, the one that told him to wait, to stay, to let someone else decide when the time was right. But it did not hold the same strength it once had, because now he could see it for what it was, not caution, not wisdom, just habit. And habit had never built anything worth standing on. He took a step forward, slow, deliberate, the sound of his boot against the stone floor louder than it should have been in the quiet, and the guards did not move, did not react. They simply watched, not with challenge, not with resistance, but with something close to acknowledgement. Ayanna stepped beside him again, matching his pace without leading, without following, just there, and as they moved toward the bars, toward the corridor, toward the door that had never been closed, Ethan realized that nothing was stopping him, nothing at all, except the man he had been before this moment, and for the first time, that man did not feel like someone he had to remain. The moment his boot crossed the line where shadow met the dim light of the corridor, Ethan Cole felt it, not resistance, not danger, but the absence of both, like stepping into open land after years behind fences he had never questioned. The iron bars stood inches behind him now, unchanged, unmoved, yet they no longer carried weight. They were just metal, just shape, nothing more, and the guards did not stop him, did not speak. They shifted slightly to the sides, creating space without being told, without even looking at each other, as if the path had already been agreed upon long before he made the choice to walk it. Ayanna moved beside him in silence, her steps steady, matching his pace without guiding it, and the man who had stood beyond the bars remained where he was, not following, not calling out, because whatever this was, it did not require his presence beyond that threshold. Ethan walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, the sound of his boots against the stone floor, echoing softly down the corridor, and with every step, something inside him loosened, not tension, but the habit of holding back, the quiet reflex to wait for permission that had shaped more of his life than he cared to admit. He glanced once to his side, the guards standing with heads slightly lowered, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, their eyes no longer avoiding Ayanna, but also not meeting hers directly, holding a line of respect that did not need to be explained. And that was when he understood something else. This place did not belong to the men who wore uniforms. It belonged to something older, something quieter, something that did not need to announce itself to be known. The corridor stretched ahead no more than 20 feet. Narrow, simple, the kind of passage meant to lead, not to hold. And at the end of it, the door stood as it had before, slightly open, unmoving, waiting without urgency. Ethan slowed as he approached it, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because for the first time, he recognized that stepping through it would not change the world outside. It would change him, and that was the part that carried. Wait, he stopped just short of the threshold, his hand still wrapped around the leather cord, the turquoise stone resting against his palm, grounding him in something that felt more real than the walls he had just left behind. Once I stepped through, he said quietly, not looking at Ayanna, not looking at anyone. There is no going back to the man who walked in. And Ayanna's voice came beside him, calm as ever. There never was, she said. And that settled it, not as an answer, but as a truth he could not argue with. Ethan let out a slow breath, then lifted his gaze, looking beyond the door for the first time, expecting something grand, something that matched the weight of the moment. But what he saw was simple, open land stretching out under a pale sky, the kind of land he had known his whole life, dry earth, distant hills, wind moving through tall grass and quiet waves, nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. And yet it felt different, because he was not standing on it as the same man. Ayanna stepped forward then, not ahead of him, but through the doorway, crossing that line without hesitation, her silhouette framed briefly by the light outside before she moved fully into it. And she did not look back, not because she did not care, but because she did not need to. The choice had already been placed where it belonged. Ethan stood there for one more second, feeling the weight of the past settle behind him. The years of choosing the safe path, the quiet path, the path that kept him unnoticed, and for a moment, it called to him, familiar, steady, offering the comfort of staying exactly where he had always been, but it no longer held the same pull, because now he could see it for what it was, not safety, but stillness mistaken for strength. He tightened his grip on the pendant once, then stepped forward, crossing the threshold in a single, unbroken motion, and the moment he did, the air felt different, lighter, not because the world had changed, but because he had stopped holding himself in place within it. The door remained open behind him, unchanged, unguarded, as if it had never been anything more than a line drawn in his own mind. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back, and saw the corridor, the bars, the guards, all still there, all exactly as they had been, and yet none of it reached him anymore, because he had stepped beyond the place where they held meaning. Ayanna stood a few feet ahead, facing the open land, the wind catching lightly at her hair, the turquoise now absent from her neck, resting instead in his hand, and for the first time, Ethan noticed something he had not allowed himself to see before. She was not leading him into something unknown, she was standing beside him in something that had always been there, waiting for him to recognize it. He walked forward to stand beside her, the ground firm beneath his boots, the horizon stretching out without boundary, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, because words did not belong in that space. Only presence, only choice, only the quiet understanding that what came next would not be decided by walls or doors or the absence of them, but by the steps they chose to take from here. And as the wind moved across the land, carrying the scent of dust and something faintly familiar, Ethan realized that freedom was not something given when a door opened. It was something claimed the moment a man stopped waiting for permission to walk through it, and standing there, with the past behind him and the open land ahead, he knew this was only the beginning of something he had not yet learned how to name. The wind did not rush to greet them. It moved slow across the open land, brushing against Ethan Cole's coat like it was testing whether he belonged there yet. And for a moment he stood still, not out of hesitation, but because everything felt too quiet, not empty, just quiet in a way that made a man hear his own thoughts clearer than he wanted to. The kind of quiet he had spent years avoiding by keeping busy, by staying in motion, by choosing work over reflection. But out here, there was nowhere for those thoughts to hide. Ayanna walked ahead a few steps, not far, just enough to give him space. Her pace unhurried, her posture steady, like someone who had walked this ground 1,000 times without needing to mark the path. And Ethan followed, not because she told him to, but because standing still no longer made sense. The ground beneath his boots felt familiar, dry, firm, scattered with small stones that shifted slightly under weight. The kind of land that demanded attention, without ever asking for it. He scanned the horizon out of habit, measuring distance, noting the low ridge to the west, the thin line of trees further out, the way the light angled across the terrain. But something in that routine felt different now. Not wrong, just incomplete, like he had been reading only half of what the land was trying to tell him all these years. "Where are we going?" he asked after a few steps, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without breaking the quiet around them. Ayanna did not turn, did not slow. "Forward," she said, and there was no direction in it, no point on the horizon, just movement. And that answer might have frustrated him before, might have made him push for something clearer, something he could map, but now it settled differently, because for the first time, forward felt like enough. They walked in silence for a while, the kind that did not press or demand to be filled, just existed between them, steady, natural. And as they moved, Ethan noticed something else, the absence of tension in his shoulders, the absence of that constant readiness that had followed him for years, not gone completely, but quieter, like a tool set down after being used too long. "You knew I would walk out," he said finally, not as a question, but as something he was still trying to understand. Ayanna slowed slightly, just enough to match his stride more closely. "I knew you could," she answered, and the distinction mattered, more than he expected, because it placed the choice back where it belonged, not in her hands, not in the hands of the men behind them, but in his. "Ethan, let that sit for a moment, the weight of it not heavy, just clear. And if I did not?" He pressed, needing to see the edges of it. She glanced at him then, briefly, her expression unchanged. Then you would still be standing there, she said, with the door open. And that was it. No judgment, no disappointment, just truth. And it settled into him in a way that made arguing feel pointless. They reached a slight rise in the land then. No more than a few feet higher, but enough to shift the view. And as they stepped over it, Ethan saw something that had not been visible before, a small group of riders in the distance. Maybe 200 yards out, their figures still against the horizon, not approaching, not retreating, just waiting. And he felt that same shift in the air again, the one he had felt in the corridor, not tension, not threat, but presence. He slowed instinctively, his body reading the scene before his mind could catch up. Your people, he said, and Ayanna nodded once. Simple, certain. They came to see who would walk with me, she said, and there was no weight of expectation in it, just fact. Ethan studied the riders, noting their posture, the way they sat their horses, balanced, patient, the kind of stillness that spoke of control rather than hesitation. They were not lined up like a show of force, not spread out like a patrol, just there, present, watching without pressing forward. And that told him more than any number of words could have. And if I had stayed, he asked, his voice quieter now, more reflective than before. Ayanna's gaze remained on the riders. Then they would have turned away, she said. Because what is not chosen cannot be carried. Ethan felt that settle deep, because it removed the idea of being taken, of being pulled into something against his will. It left only one thing standing: choice. And whether he was ready for it or not, he had already made one. The riders began to move then, not all at once, not in a rush, but slowly, their horses stepping forward in a measured line, closing the distance without urgency. And as they approached, Ethan noticed something else. None of them reached for anything. None of them spoke, their attention steady, focused, not on him alone, but on both of them, as if what mattered was not who he was, but where he stood. Ayanna stopped walking, and Ethan did the same. The two of them standing side by side on that slight rise, the open land stretching out behind them, the riders approaching from the front, and for a moment, time seemed to settle into that space, not moving forward, not pulling back, just holding. The first of the riders reached them after a few seconds, a man older than the others, his hair long, streaked with gray, his eyes steady. And he looked at Ayanna first, a silent exchange passing between them that did not need to be spoken. Then his gaze shifted to Ethan, and it held there, not questioning, not challenging, just seeing. The same way the man at the cell had seen him, and Ethan did not look away, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because something in him no longer felt the need to step back from being seen. The rider gave a small nod then, not to Ayanna, not fully to Ethan, but to the space between them, to the choice that had been made without words. And that nod carried more weight than any approval could have. Ayanna reached out then, not taking Ethan's hand, not guiding him, just resting her fingers lightly against his wrist for a brief moment. A touch that was neither claim nor reassurance, just presence. And then she let it fall away. The riders shifted slightly, opening a path between them without being told. And Ethan understood, not through explanation, but through feeling, that the path ahead was not being given to him. It was being acknowledged, and as he took his next step forward, moving between them, he realized that whatever this was, whatever name it might carry, it was no longer something he was being brought into. It was something he had stepped into on his own, and there was no turning back to the man who had once believed standing still was the safest place to be. The riders did not close around him. They opened, and that was the first thing Ethan Cole noticed as he stepped between them. Not a circle meant to hold, but a path meant to pass through, their horses shifting just enough to give space, their eyes steady, not following him with suspicion, not measuring him with doubt, but acknowledging something that had already been decided before he understood it himself. The ground beneath his boots felt the same, dry, firm, familiar, yet every step carried a different weight now, not heavier, but clearer, like each movement mattered in a way it never had before. Ayanna walked beside him, not ahead, not behind, and the riders fell into motion around them without command, a quiet alignment that spoke of understanding rather than control. No one spoke, not because words were forbidden, but because they were not needed. The wind moved across the group, carrying the soft sound of leather and reins, the steady rhythm of hooves against earth, and for a moment, Ethan felt something settle inside him that he had not felt in years. Not peace exactly, but a kind of balance. The kind that comes when a man stops fighting the direction he is already moving in. They traveled for a while without turning, without stopping, the land stretching ahead in long, open lines, the sun climbing slightly higher, casting longer shadows that moved with them rather than against them. And as they rode, Ethan began to notice the small things, the way the riders kept a certain distance without crowding, the way they shifted position without signals, the way no one broke the rhythm of the group. It was not discipline in the way he had seen among soldiers or hired men. It was something else, something that came from shared understanding, from knowing where you stood without needing to be told. They are not watching me, Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, and Ayana's voice came beside him, steady as always. They are not watching for you, she said. They are watching with you. And that difference settled deep, because it removed the weight of being judged, replaced it with something he had not expected, inclusion, not given freely, not assumed, but recognized. Ethan glanced at the rider who had nodded earlier, the older man now riding slightly ahead, his posture unchanged, his presence still carrying that quiet authority that did not need to be shown. And for a moment, Ethan considered asking something, anything that would place this into words he could hold, but the question never formed fully, because he already knew the answer would not come in a way he was used to hearing. The land began to shift slightly as they moved, the flat stretch giving way to a gentle slope that led toward a cluster of trees in the distance, not dense, not hidden, just enough to break the open line of the horizon. And as they approached, Ethan noticed something else, figures moving among the trees, not riders, but people on foot, their shapes blending with the land in a way that made them part of it rather than separate from it. He slowed slightly, not out of caution, but awareness, because this felt different, not a meeting, not a crossing, but an arrival. Ayana did not slow, her pace steady, her gaze forward, and the riders adjusted again, their formation widening just enough to guide the movement without forcing it. And as they reached the edge of the trees, the figures stepped forward, not rushing, not gathering tightly, just coming into view, men and women, young and old, their eyes calm, their presence grounded. And they did not stare at Ethan the way strangers do. They did not look through him or past him. They looked at him the same way the others had, seeing without pressing, acknowledging without claiming. And that steadiness made something in his chest tighten in a way he could not explain, because it was easier to face suspicion than it was to face quiet acceptance. Ayana stepped forward then, moving a few feet ahead of him, not separating, just shifting into a place that belonged to her. And the older man dismounted slowly, his boots touching the earth with a familiarity that spoke of years spent on this ground. He looked at Ayana first, a small nod passing between them. Then his gaze moved to Ethan again, holding there for a moment longer this time. And in that look, Ethan felt something change, not outside, but within himself, because for the first time, he did not feel like he needed to prove why he was standing there. The man spoke then, his voice carrying just enough to reach those gathered without breaking the quiet that held the space together. He walked, he said, and there was no question in it, no doubt, just recognition. Ayana's voice followed, just as steady, he chose. And those two words settled into the space between them, not as a statement for others, but as a truth placed where it could not be ignored. Ethan felt the pendant in his hand, the leather cord still wrapped loosely around his fingers, the stone resting against his palm, and without thinking, he lifted it slightly, not to show it, not to present it, just to feel it in the open air. And the older man's eyes flicked to it briefly, then back to Ethan, and he gave another small nod, not approval, not permission, just acknowledgement of something that had already been accepted. The group around them remained still, not silent in tension, but quiet in understanding. And for a moment, nothing moved. Nothing needed to, because what mattered had already taken place before any of them spoke. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man realizes he has stepped further than he ever intended, and yet feels more certain than he has in years. He looked at Ayana then, not searching, not questioning, just seeing her as she stood there, part of this place, part of this moment. And he understood something he had not allowed himself to before. This was not about leaving something behind. It was about stepping into something that had been waiting long before he arrived. And as the wind moved through the trees, carrying the soft rustle of leaves and the faint scent of earth, Ethan realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by where he had been, but by where he was willing to stand now. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The stillness did not break when the words settled. It shifted, like the air itself had accepted something and moved forward without needing to announce it. And Ethan Cole stood there with the pendant resting against his palm, feeling its weight not as an object, but as a line. He had already crossed. The people around him did not close in, did not step back. They remained where they were, grounded, present, as if they understood that what mattered now was not what had been said, but what would follow it. Ayanna turned slightly, her movement small but deliberate, her gaze moving across the group before returning to him. And in that glance there was no question, no check for doubt, only recognition of what had already been chosen. "You will need to see it," she said, quietly, and though she did not explain what it was, Ethan understood enough to follow, not because he had answers, but because he had stopped waiting for them to come first. She began walking again, deeper into the cluster of trees, and this time, the group did not follow as one. They parted, some remaining where they stood, others moving in different directions with quiet purpose, not leaving, not dispersing, but continuing something that had already been in motion long before he arrived. Ethan walked beside her, the ground softer now beneath his boots, the shade of the trees cooling the air just enough to change the rhythm of his breath, the scent of earth stronger here, mixed with something faintly sweet, something that reminded him of rain that had not yet fallen. "What am I meant to see?" he asked after a few steps, his voice low, steady, and Ayanna did not answer right away. She led him through a narrow opening between two trees, their branches arching overhead like something shaped by time rather than intention, and beyond them, the land opened again, but differently this time, not wide and empty, but held, defined by the space it created rather than the distance it stretched. At the center of it stood a small fire, not large, not bright, just steady, its smoke rising in a thin line that disappeared into the sky without effort, and around it, a few people sat, not speaking, not moving much, their presence calm, grounded, like the fire itself. Ethan slowed. As they approached, not out of hesitation, but because something in the space asked for it, not in words, but in feeling, Ayanna stopped a few feet from the fire, and he did the same, the warmth reaching them just enough to be felt without demanding attention. "This is where we listen," she said. And that word, listen, settled differently than anything else she had spoken, because it did not ask for action, did not ask for decision. It asked for stillness, the kind he had spent years avoiding. Ethan looked at the fire, at the steady way it burned without effort, without force, just existing in its place. And for a moment, he did not know what to do with that, because there was nothing to fix, nothing to measure, nothing to control, only something to witness. "I have spent most of my life doing," he said slowly, more to himself than to her, "not listening." And Ayanna's voice came soft beside him. "That is why you are here," she said, and there was no judgment in it, no weight of what he should have done differently, just truth placed where it belonged. Ethan exhaled slowly, then stepped forward, just one step closer to the fire, the heat brushing against his skin, grounding him in a way he had not expected. He lowered himself to sit across from it, the movement unfamiliar. In its stillness, his body wanting to shift, to adjust, to do something, anything. But he held himself there, letting the quiet settle around him instead of pushing against it. Ayanna remained standing for a moment longer, then sat beside him, not too close, not distant, just present, and the others did not look at him directly, did not mark his arrival with anything more than a subtle awareness, as if his presence had already been accounted for. Time moved differently there, not in minutes or moments, but in breaths, in the rise and fall of the fire, in the subtle shift of light through the branches above, and slowly, without him realizing when it began, the noise in his mind, the constant pull to think ahead, to measure what came next, began to quiet, not disappear, but soften, like a voice lowering itself when it realizes it no longer needs to shout. "What happens now?" he asked after a while, his voice quieter than before, not out of caution, but because the space did not require anything louder. Ayana looked at the fire, her expression unchanged. "Now you see what has always been there," she said. And again, the words did not explain. They pointed, and Ethan followed that direction not with his eyes, but with his attention, the fire. The people, the land, the air itself, all of it unchanged, all of it present long before he stepped into it. And for the first time, he understood something that had been just out of reach before. This was not about becoming something new. It was about removing what had kept him from seeing what was already there. He felt the pendant in his hand again, the leather warm now from his skin, the stone steady, and without thinking, he slipped the cord over his head, letting it rest against his chest, where Ayana had worn it before, not as a symbol, not as a mark, but as a reminder of the moment he had chosen to step forward instead of staying still. The fire crackled softly, the sound blending with the quiet around it. And as Ethan sat there, no longer trying to fill the silence, no longer trying to shape what came next, he realized that the path ahead was not something he needed to search for. It would reveal itself the same way this moment had, not with force, not with demand, but with presence. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was willing to meet it that way. The fire did not grow larger as time passed. It remained steady, its flames rising and settling in a rhythm that did not rush or hesitate. And Ethan Cole found himself watching it longer than he expected, not because it demanded attention, but because it did not. It simply existed, and in that, it began to pull something quiet out of him, something he had not given space to in years. The need to understand without needing to control, the need to be present without needing to act. He shifted slightly where he sat, the ground firm beneath him, the warmth of the fire reaching his hands, the pendant resting against his chest now, no longer something he held, but something he carried, and that difference settled deeper than he had anticipated. "You are thinking too much again," Ayana said softly beside him, not as a correction, not as a warning, just an observation placed gently where it could be heard. Ethan let out a small breath through his nose, almost a quiet laugh. "I have spent most of my life doing that," he replied, his voice low, steady, and she nodded once, her gaze still on the fire. "Then you have spent most of your life missing what is in front of you," she said, and there was no sharpness in it, no edge meant to cut, only truth that did not ask permission to exist. Ethan let those words sit, not pushing back, not trying to reshape them into something easier to accept, just letting them be, and for the first time, that felt like enough. The people around the fire remained quiet, their presence steady, not distant, not intrusive, just there, each of them holding their place without shifting the space around them. And slowly, Ethan began to notice something else. The way their stillness was not empty. It was full of awareness, of attention, of something that did not need to move to be alive. And it made his own restlessness stand out in a way he could not ignore. He drew in a slow breath, then another, letting the rhythm of it settle without forcing it into anything. And with each breath, the urge to fill the silence with thought, with questions, with movement, began to loosen its grip, not gone, but quieter, like a habit losing its hold when it is no longer fed. "Why me?" he asked after a while, the question coming not from confusion now, but from a place deeper, a place that wanted to understand without needing to resist. Ayana did not answer right away. She reached forward slightly, adjusting a small piece of wood at the edge of the fire, not to change it, just to maintain its balance. Then she sat back. Again, her movements simple, precise. "You were already walking toward this," she said finally, and Ethan frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought. "I was standing still," he said, and she shook her head once. "You were standing in a place that could not hold you any longer," she replied, and that shifted something inside him, because it reframed everything he had believed about the years behind him, not as time spent waiting, but as time spent reaching a point where staying no longer made sense. The fire cracked softly, a small sound that carried more weight in the quiet than it would have anywhere else, and Ethan looked into it again, not searching, not measuring, just seeing, and for a moment, something surfaced, not a memory exactly, but a feeling, the long days on open land, the endless horizon, the sense that there was always something just beyond reach, something he had never quite stepped into. And now, sitting there, he realized that feeling had not been about the land at all. It had been about him, about the distance between who he was and who he could become, and that distance had never been measured in miles. It had been measured in choices. And now, he said quietly, more to himself than to her, I stepped, and Ayana's voice came soft beside him. Yes, she said. And now you learn how to stand. And that word, stand, carried more weight than walk ever had, because walking could be done without thinking, without choosing, but standing required something else, something steadier, something rooted. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly, not forced, just natural. And as he sat there, he felt something settle into place. Not a final answer, not a clear path, but a foundation, something he could stand on without needing to question whether it would hold. The people around the fire began to move then, slowly, not all at once, some standing, some stepping away, their movements quiet, purposeful, not leaving the space empty, but allowing it to shift, to change without breaking. And Ethan watched them go without the urge to follow, without the need to ask where they were going, because for the first time, he understood that not every movement required his involvement. Some things simply were, and that was enough. Ayana remained beside him, her presence steady, unchanged, and after a moment, she rose to her feet, brushing a small amount of dust from her hands. Come, she said, not as a command, not as a pull, just an invitation placed where it could be accepted or not. Ethan looked at the fire one last time, then pushed himself up slowly, his movements unhurried, his balance steady, and as he stood, he felt the pendant shift slightly against his chest, a small reminder of the step he had taken, of the choice he had made. And for the first time, it did not feel like something he needed to question. It felt like something he was ready to carry. He stepped forward to stand beside her, and together, they moved away from the fire, not leaving it behind, but carrying its quiet with them. And as they walked, Ethan realized that what he had found there was not something tied to that place. It was something he could take with him, something that would shape the steps ahead in ways he had not yet begun to understand. And for the first time, that did not feel uncertain, it felt right. The path away from the fire did not feel like leaving. It felt like carrying something forward, something that did not fade as distance grew. And Ethan Cole walked beside Ayana with a steadiness that had not been there before, not forced, not practiced, just present, the ground shifting slightly beneath his boots as they moved beyond the trees, the open land returning again, but now it no longer felt empty. It felt wide in a different way, like it had room for something he had only just begun to understand. The wind moved across the grass in slow waves, brushing against his coat, carrying the faint scent of earth and distance. And for the first time, he did not measure it, did not calculate direction or change. He simply felt it pass through. You are quieter, Ayana said beside him, her voice soft, not questioning, just noticing. And Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze fixed ahead. I am not trying to outrun my thoughts anymore, he said, and that truth landed with a simplicity he had never allowed himself before, because for years he had mistaken movement for progress, noise for purpose, and now, with neither pressing in on him, he found something else rising in its place, clarity, not loud, not sharp, but steady. They walked for a while without speaking, the rhythm of their steps aligning naturally, not by effort, but by presence. And as they moved, Ethan began to notice the land again, not as something to cross, but as something to read, the slight dip ahead where water might gather after rain, the scattered stones that marked a shift in soil, the distant line of hills that held the horizon without closing it, all of it familiar, and yet, all of it different, because he was no longer looking at it as something separate from himself. He was standing within it, part of it, and that realization settled deeper than anything that had come before. What comes next? He asked. After some time, not from uncertainty, but from a place that was ready to move forward without needing to control the shape of it. Ayana slowed slightly, her gaze lifting toward the horizon, then returning to him. You return, she said, and Ethan's brow furrowed faintly, not in confusion, but in the weight of what that implied. Return to what? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer. She held his gaze for a moment, steady, clear. To the place you left, she said, but not as the man who walked away. And that settled into him with a quiet force, because it pointed him back towards something he had not yet faced, not the land, not the work, but the life he had stepped out of without ever fully understanding why. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting toward the distance, toward a direction he had not consciously chosen, but one that felt familiar all the same. "There is nothing waiting for me there," he said. Not bitter, not defensive, just stating what he had believed for a long time. Ayana's expression did not change, but her voice carried a different weight now, not heavier, but more grounded. "Then you will see it for what it is," she replied. "Not for what you told yourself it was." And that cut deeper than anything else she had said, because it touched something he had not wanted to examine, the quiet belief that there had been nothing left for him, nothing worth returning to, and now, standing here, he could see that belief had been less about truth and more about avoidance. He had left because staying had required something he had not been ready to give. And now, that had changed, not all at once, not completely, but enough. They reached a slight ridge then, the land rising gently before falling away again. And as they stepped up onto it, the view shifted, revealing a long stretch of open ground leading toward a distant cluster of structures, small from where they stood, barely more than shapes against the horizon, but enough for Ethan to recognize. His breath caught slightly, not sharp, just enough to mark the moment. "That is," he began, but the words did not need to finish. Ayana nodded once. "Yes," she said. And that was all. No explanation, no reassurance, just confirmation. Ethan stood there for a moment, looking out at the place he had once called his own, the land he had worked, the ground he had walked without ever truly standing on it. And now, seeing it from this distance, from this place within himself, it looked different, not changed, but clearer, like a picture he had once seen through dust and now saw without it. "Why send me back?" he asked, not resisting, but needing to understand the shape of this next step. Ayana stepped closer to the edge of the ridge, her gaze resting on the same view. "Because walking forward does not always mean leaving everything behind," she said. "Sometimes it means returning with eyes that can see." And that settled into him with a quiet certainty, because it aligned with something he had already begun to feel, that this was not about escape, not about finding something new far from where he had been, but about facing what he had left with a different understanding. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing slightly, not with relief, but with acceptance, the kind that comes when a man recognizes the road ahead is not easier, but it is right. He reached up briefly, his fingers brushing the pendant at his chest, grounding himself in the choice he had already made. And for the first time, the idea of going back did not feel like returning to something empty. It felt like stepping into something unfinished, something that had been waiting not for him to come back the same, but for him to return ready to stand differently. Ayana turned slightly then, her presence steady beside him. "I will walk with you to the edge," she said, not as a promise, not as a condition, just as something offered. And Ethan nodded once, not needing more than that, because he understood now that this path, like the one before it, would not be walked for him. It would be walked by him, step by step, choice by choice. And as he took that first step down from the ridge, toward the place he had once left behind, he did not feel the pull of the past trying to hold him back. He felt the quiet pull of something ahead, something that was no longer waiting for him to arrive, but for him to stand within it as the man he was becoming. The slope down from the ridge felt longer than it had looked from above, not because of distance, but because of what waited at the end of it. And Ethan Cole walked with a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, each step placed with the kind of awareness that had begun to replace the old habit of moving without thinking. The land stretched out in front of him, familiar in shape, in color, in the way the wind brushed across it. And yet every detail seemed sharper now, not changed, just seen. Without the weight he used to carry in his chest, Ayana walked beside him, steady as ever, her presence quiet, not filling the space, just holding it. And neither of them spoke for a while, because the silence no longer pressed against him the way it once had. It moved with him, like something he had finally learned how to carry instead of escape. As they drew closer, the structures ahead took clearer form, the outline of a small ranch, weathered wood, a low fence line, a barn that leaned slightly as if it had stood too long without being tended. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, Not sharp, not painful, just there, like a memory returning without asking permission. You left this behind, Ayanna said quietly, not as a question, and Ethan nodded once, his eyes fixed on the place ahead. I told myself there was nothing left to hold me there, he replied. And the words sounded thinner now than they had when he first believed them. Ayanna did not respond right away. She let the silence sit between them. And that silence said more than any answer could have, because it allowed him to hear the truth in his own voice. They reached the fence line after a few minutes. The wood worn, the posts slightly crooked, the gate hanging open just enough to move without effort. And Ethan stopped there for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the top rail, the texture rough beneath his fingers, familiar in a way that reached deeper than sight. He had built this with his own hands, piece by piece, years ago, before everything had started to feel like it was slipping through his grip, before he chose to step away instead of stand his ground. Nothing changed, he said quietly. More too, he said, his voice steady, and she stepped forward then, crossing into the space without hesitation, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as someone who stood beside him by choice. The room held their presence without shifting, without changing, just allowing it to be. And for a moment, they stood there in the quiet, the kind that no longer needed to be filled. Ethan looked around once more, taking in the details he had once ignored, the small things that had been there all along, and he understood now that this place had never been empty. It had been waiting, not for someone to fix it, not for something to change, but for him to return with eyes that could see it clearly. And as he stood there, with the past no longer something he needed to avoid, but something he could face without turning away, he realized that this was the moment that mattered most. Not the leaving, not the journey, but the return. The choice to stand where he once could not, and to remain there without stepping back. And in that stillness, something stronger than movement settled into place, something that did not need to be proven, did not need to be spoken. It simply was, and for the first time, that felt like enough. The quiet inside the house did not feel empty anymore. It held something now, something that had not been there before, or maybe something that had always been there, and he had never stayed long enough to notice. And Ethan Cole stood in the center of the room with the door still open behind him, the light from outside stretching across the wooden floor in a long, steady line, not forcing its way in, just resting there, waiting to be accepted. He moved slowly, not searching for anything, not trying to fix what had been left undone, just walking through the space with a different kind of attention, his fingers brushing lightly across the table, the surface worn but solid, the chair slightly out of place as if it had been left mid-thought. And for a moment, a memory surfaced, not loud, not overwhelming, just present, the way he used to sit there at the end of a long day, staring out at the land without really seeing it, thinking about what needed to be done next instead of